Hi, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on children, adolescents, and Mediascape in India with Usha Raman, who is a professor in the Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, where she teaches and researches in the areas of digital cultures, science and health communication, feminist media studies, and children and media. Apart from four co edited books, a textbook on writing, and over 50 journal articles and book chapters, her recent work includes the co authored volume, Digital Expressions of the Selfie, The Social Life of Selfies in India, Routledge 2024, and a novel, Polite Conversations, B Books 2024. She served as the Vice President of the International Association for Media and Communication Research from 2020 to 2024 and is co founder of FemLab, a feminist academic activist collaboration on the future of women's work. Usha, welcome to Doing Sociology. I am very excited to speak to you and thank you so much for making time today.
Thank you, Rituparna, for having me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation as well.
Right. So let me begin with a more broad question about, the Indian context, where we see that low-cost mobile phones, cheap data plans, and a vernacularization of content has actually furthered access, cutting across the socio-economic strata. And what specific research priorities might emerge in this context? I'm actually looking forward to your answer because this is one area of research where young people seem to be taking a lot of interest.
So, thanks for that question. When we think about the digital in India, of course, the last 10 years has seen this huge, proliferation of devices, low-cost devices, as you said, and cheap data. In fact, I think India has the lowest data costs worldwide. So this has really led to a very deep penetration of the internet and online resources in general, much of it on the mobile. So as opposed to many Western societies where, or you would say the minority world, where a lot of internet access happens on laptops, desktops, and possibly tablets. In India, I would say the majority of internet access happens on mobile phones. So this really makes things much more accessible for young people who are more likely to be given either their own phones or have access to a phone in the home, even if it's a shared device. And the phone is perhaps not as risky a device to share in terms of cost, etc., with young people as a laptop or a desktop might be, even in families that could afford the larger devices. So this has meant that a lot of young people, and when I say young people, you see even, very young children being exposed or being allowed to use devices. And It also means that life is changing for these young people. They're growing in different ways. Their environments for learning, for relating, for the possibilities of work. All of that seems to be changing. So, as researchers, particularly as researchers who study social and cultural life, I think it's just opening up questions that we hadn't even imagined, and in fact, questions that are continuing to emerge because those of us who study social life, I think, still remember times that were pre-digital, or when the digital was not as embedded in our lives, or we were not as embedded in digital life as we are now. So so I think, sweeping answer to that question is many research priorities. Um, some of them have to do with the nature of relationships, not just relationships with people, but also with the world. So one of a teacher I was talking to recently, for instance, was telling me how young children, particularly those who started their education online in during the COVID lockdown, when they came back to the classroom, they would say things like, "Can you not make that go faster?" Because they were so used to fast forwarding content on the web. So that's just a very tiny example of how deeply the digital is transforming life. across the board, both for those who are privileged in many ways and for those who perhaps have much less privilege, both materially, socially, and politically. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for that response. And maybe I can also ask you to dwell a little bit on the methods that can be used to study some of these issues and, methods that are cutting across social sciences and humanities.
Mhm. I think that's a fairly complex question. And I am a qualitative researcher, so I know that there are many methods that focus on data capture that is more quantitative, that uses computational methods. And I think for researchers entering this space, I think it would really be worthwhile to start gaining familiarity with methods that are not only the old qualitative tools. Having said that, I think qualitative tools are still extremely important and need to work alongside other emerging computational statistical methods. And if I were to speak primarily of qualitative tools, I would say, I think the tried and tested methods of deep ethnography, qualitative interviewing, observation, both participant and non-participant. I think all of those methods continue to be extremely valid. But when you move them online or when you're looking at life online, they probably need to take on slightly different. I think the nuances are a little different. So now a lot of people talk about netnography, right, which is a method of online ethnography. And while online ethnography in principle is similar to offline, in person, in material space type ethnography, I think the ethical considerations, the ways in which we might define what the field is, um, how we think about participation, the kind of data that's available to us online as opposed to offline. I think all of these things uh, require that we apply those same tools in slightly different ways and reconsider many ethical questions. So just to sort of make that answer a little more precise, I would say that the same tools that we have employed in pre-digital spaces and in pre-digital environments continue to be relevant, but the digital has, in some ways, um, made accessible layers of life that were not accessible to us in material worlds. And the converse is also true, right? The digital also masks certain things that were accessible to us in offline spaces. So I think as researchers, it's important for us to apply tools with a fuller understanding of what the digital implies. So what are the digital traces that we follow, right? So there are data traces that people leave. And as you harvest those traces, what responsibility do you have to the people who leave those traces? So I think the ethical landscape has changed, and I don't think there's sufficient um, understanding, among young researchers, and possibly many of us who teach also are still trying to figure out how one thinks about these questions. So I'm not sure if I've like gone beyond the boundaries of that question, but yeah.
No, no, not at all. And thank you again. So, I have a more specific question in terms of how can we contextualize, let's say, existing knowledge to help support young people and, of course, their parents as well in maximizing the benefits of this digital or social world, even when we are taking into account the nuances of the local.
I think there are lots of questions embedded in that question. Um, I think what makes it complicated is the notion of the local, right? What is that local? I mean, on the one hand, the local is the immediate environment in which we find ourselves, the material conditions of life, um, and the various networks within which that exists, right? So if you live in a peri-urban community, or you live in a rural community, or you live in the city, depending on what socioeconomic bracket you're in. There are those material conditions that one has to pay attention to. And as young people, I think young people tend to, and again, this may be a generalization, but um, there is a confusion about which world they belong in, because it is so easy to escape into the digital and to create communities, to find presence, to create presence, to build networks in these spaces that are not accessible to them in their material worlds. Um, so reconciling those differences, trying to build a sense of self that is not dependent only on the distant, but also is grounded in terms of where they are. I think those are the sort of confusions that we'll have to address. And I think that that can be addressed possibly if in school there is a very strong focus on physical learning and using one's hands and bodies, etc., knowing that space well before one really engages deeply with the online. It's impossible to not engage with the online, and I wouldn't recommend that we go into a Luddite kind of approach where we say let's deny all technology to young people. But I think to build capacities of dealing with the material world and both the social world as well as the natural world, uh, very in sort of grounded ways before children are exposed um, to the online would be a good way to start. Um, and that is for very young children. Now, if we move to older children, teenagers, adolescents, I think the questions are a little different, because I think that is when they're gaining a sense of agency of their position in the world. And it's not so much what they're interacting with, but how they want to shape their environments. And I think that's a space that we need to increasingly involve these young people in order to understand how to fashion the intellectual, the psychological, the emotional tools for them. And I think that is not something that is happening much in the Indian context. In the West, for instance, in the London School of Economics, people like Sonia Livingston have a large project called Digital Futures for Children. And their fundamental approach is we cannot talk about children's futures without involving children. And their realities, their lives are very different from the kind of realities policymakers and educators are familiar with. So I think that should be something that we start with. Let's start with the child. Let's start with understanding what their realities are like, what their tactile and psychological lives are like, and then try and proceed from there. I know your question was more about how do we use not traditional, but let's say existing bodies of knowledge. And I think those existing bodies of knowledge continue to be extremely relevant, right? I mean, the digital is only a layer over what already has existed for years. But it's an important enough layer for us to not simply add it on, but to see what the interactions are between existing knowledges and these new environments in which those knowledges have to be applied.
Right. You mentioned about involving young people and how is it how it is not happening in the Indian context much, but that it's already in the Western context. So, do you have any ideas about how we could do that in the Indian context?
So I'd like to just kind of point to some research that a student of mine did, Devina Sarvate, where she, in her work, she was trying to understand what children's lived realities were like and what negotiations they undertook to make their lives in the digital space. So what she did was she asked them to do a walkthrough with her. She tried to understand how they fashioned their social media profiles, how they dealt with things like privacy, protecting themselves from stranger danger, those kinds of things. And she found that actually young people, because this environment is natural to them, they actually have evolved strategies that, because they have evolved from their own experience, they tend to apply with much more consideration and caution. So this is an observation that then can be fed back to policymakers who can then think about either designing digital environments, regulating digital environments in ways that take into account children's own experiences rather than an imagined experience that an adult might have. So I think that is one way of doing it, by, co-learning with children what they're doing and how they're doing it. And then, of course, I'm not saying that the negotiations they evolve are perfect, but it's a place that allows us then to start, and then apply, adult wisdom, our wisdom from existing knowledge, etc., to particularly in areas like design, technology design, and regulation.
Right. So, in a way, there is a need for more collaboration between disciplinary thinkings also, right? Okay.
Yes.
So, I mean, connected to the previous two questions, young people's lives are inextricably tied in with the digital, whether it's for education, engagement, leisure, or work. I mean, we all know that now. But how do they negotiate these very important issues of access, safety, and privacy in the digital world?
Um, so I think, again, because technology keeps changing, and given that the internet is no longer that, it was imagined as a sort of safe, ideal space, and it is far from that. Um, and because of that, there are risks that everyone faces, children primarily, but also adults in this space, because those who want to subvert the space either for commercial or other more nefarious ends seem to always be a step ahead in terms of technology. So that's the larger fear. So there is a fear of exploitation, both in in terms of sexual exploitation or commercial exploitation or financial exploitation, and increasingly also political manipulation. And these are the fears that all of us have. And when it comes to children, our sense of this fear is doubled, because we imagine them as particularly vulnerable to these kinds of issues. And so I think, again, this is a matter of regulation and education. I think both. Um, and I think these risks in the digital are, in a way, they seem larger now, but they are similar to the risks that we faced even in the physical world, right? I mean, when you ask a child to go to school on a bus, in some ways, it's a similar kind of risk that they are undertaking, but we know that world, so we feel more comfortable allowing the child to take that risk. Whereas this world is something that we feel like we cannot know completely. Um, so, yeah. So I think, as adults, as researchers, as people who can perhaps influence the system, I think, as I said, the response has to be in two directions at least, and there may be other things as well. And one is education, and the other is regulation. Regulation, I think, has been something that governments have been very slow to undertake in the digital space. It's been extremely reactive, not proactive enough. And especially with regulation concerning children, I think it's been about bans. So recently, the Australian government and some parts of the UK also banned social media access in schools. The rules for accessing social media have become more stringent in these places. Now, a ban is one way to tackle it, but many people feel that a ban doesn't really solve the problem, and instead we should put more pressure on companies, on the big tech companies to design in a way that ensures safety. So I think that's a direction in which regulation probably should proceed. The other is, of course, education, and education cannot happen without exposure, right? Without exposure and without openness. Um, so I think children, rather than telling them not to do something, it's important to tell them how to do something. And again, this is a difficult um, thing to tackle because the technology is so runaway. Right now, we're talking about artificial intelligence, for instance, where the risks are not just in terms of exploitation of the kind that we are familiar with, but also new forms of exploitation, like with deep fakes and using image and voice to impersonate people. So how does one deal with all of this? And one is greater critical education, so that children grow up with a healthy skepticism, um, and um, and yeah, so that they know that you don't just believe everything you see, but also that there are advantages to not using certain things. That so like we talk about Chat GPT, right? And how it's invaded our classrooms, and how we're constantly having to tell young people what is actually happening when they use AI tools to do their assignments. So if we can instill in children the joy of discovery for themselves, which means that we have to educate. And again, this goes back to broader pedagogic problems and not just the digital. But if we can educate to process rather than product, then some of the things that we're grappling with now in terms of use of unfair or unethical use of AI may be dealt with. So again, I mean, the questions you're asking are big questions, and I don't know that it's easy to contain the answers, or make them very neat. But it also means that as social researchers, I think the challenge for us is to define problems in very specific ways, because the big questions are too big to tackle through any one research project. So are there ways in which we can slice up this big problem, let's say, of digital literacy? What does it mean in different spaces? What does it mean in terms of work capability? What does it mean in terms of creativity? What does it mean in terms of relational and emotional intelligence? And then see what we need to learn in each of these slices so that we can better educate and better regulate.
No, I think, this discussion will be very useful because we haven't had one on the digital per se in terms of, regulation and the ideas that you are bringing in. So thank you so much for that. We've been talking about young people, but I also want to ask you about what it specifically means for children to be growing up digitally in, today's India.
I think that's the big research question, right? What does it mean for children to grow up today? And apparently this year, the children who are born this year are called the generation beta, right? So we've just had alpha, which ends with 2024, and from 25, it's generation beta. And, as somebody who's been teaching, young adults since 1998, I can see, generational differences over the past 25 26 years. Um, and this is people who have actually grown up in a world where they can imagine not having the internet, right? Not all these kids have grown up in an internet suffused world, whereas children who are in their infancy today or even starting school, the very notion of literacy has changed. The way they interact with material has changed. Therefore, attention spans are different. We're talking much more about ideas like engagement, which and the nature of engagement has changed. So I think we still need to understand what these realities are, and of course, all of these realities are emerging in a planetary context which is increasingly precarious, right? Both in terms of the ecology and all kinds of geopolitical issues. So the digital is often seen as a refuge both by parents and by slightly older children. Um, so I think it poses a lot of challenges for us to understand and then to try and frame questions in a way that they can be usefully answered. I know that's a cop out, but yeah.
No, no, that's okay. Last question, for our conversation. How do children use media and, what effects do they have on their childhood? And how can these be managed through policy and practice? I know you talked a little bit about young people already, but if we want to know specifically about children.
I think, there are many schools, different schools of thought, and some of them seem to be diametrically opposed to each other. So there is, if you look at the schools in India or the school education environment in India, you'll find that there is the mainstream. And again, the mainstream is not one thing. It's quite a large, swathe of types of schools even there. But let's say the mainstream are schools that primarily see education as a means to producing citizens who can engage with the world profitably and productively, right? So the goal of education then tends to be to shape the child to fit into the world as it exists, possibly to answer questions and challenges that the world throws at them. So in those schools, the digital tools, digital environments, digital opportunities, all of them become central to the way they educate. So they see it's important to introduce children to make them literate in terms of dealing with the digital. Whether it is to introduce coding, right in primary schools, or showing them how to write prompts for AI. So all of this is the way in which the mainstream thinks about preparing the child to live in a digital world. If you think about this other school of thought, which is a very narrow slice, which is the alternative, and again, the alternative takes many forms, but in the alternative, it tends to be that let's look at how the child can actualize herself or himself, how the child can actually develop internal capabilities. And those internal capabilities will then allow them to deal with whatever the world throws at them. So the child in this case is given a very strong sense of self, builds internal resources, psychological, intellectual, emotional, and then you introduce technology at a later stage. So schools of this kind will not introduce technology until maybe class 4 or 5. And I don't know that there's been any systematic work, particularly in recent years, that has looked at how graduates from these schools, or even let's say middle schoolers and high schoolers, are dealing with questions of technology and what kind of capacities they have, in comparison with each other. But that might be something that we need to look at. Personally, I veer to the side of building internal capabilities, because technologies will keep changing, and we should not be in a situation where we're constantly trying to chase after technology. Instead, we should be able to build the kind of literacies that will allow us to bend technology to our own ends. And I think now we're in a situation where we feel like AI is overtaking us. But in fact, we have control. I mean, there's no inevitability about technology, but we assume there is an inevitability. And I think that's a role that governments and policymakers and educators have to play, that, to educate people out of this sense of inevitability. We still need to be in control of technology and not let technology control us. And that, I think, should be the goal of research as well.
I think that's a very good note to end this conversation on, that we should be in charge of technology rather than, just inevitably resigned to that technology being overpowering our senses. And thank you so much for that. I think this was a very enriching conversation. And I hope that our young listeners and viewers take a lot from this conversation. Also, read your works on the digital and how young people and children use mediascapes and digital world. So, thank you so much once again for doing this.
You're welcome. Thanks. I enjoyed the conversation.